I'm 29 now and I've had a lot of horrific experiences, but nothing sits in my brain the way one night from when I was 15 does. It was my first real babysitting job that wasn't just watching a cousin for an hour while my aunt ran to the store. This was a family friend. The kind where your parents know their parents and everyone assumes it's basically safe by default. They're cool with me telling the story online. So, their names are Mark and Diane, and their son Charlie was 5. They lived in a nice house in a quiet, normal neighborhood. Looking back, that's part of why it messed with me. It didn't feel like the kind of house where anything bad could happen. Felt like a normal place like where I grew up. It was a Friday night in early fall. My parents dropped me off around 6:30 and Mark and Diane were already dressed up. Mark shook my hand like I was applying for a job at his office. And Diane kept calling me a lifesaver. Mark and Diane went over the basics like when we eat, what we eat, when his light's out, and keeping his door cracked open. If he has to use the bathroom, walk him there because he sometimes gets scared in the hallway at night. Mark also pointed out the locks. There was a front door lock they never used because they came in through the garage. The back door, though, was the one I'd use if I needed to step out onto the deck. He mentioned I'd have to lock both the locks, and he pointed to the deadbolt up top and the regular doorbell lock underneath. I nodded like I understood. I thought it was obvious. I thought a lock was a lock. They left around 7. As soon as their car pulled away, Charlie asked if we could play board games and hide and seek. And the hide and seek I tried to talk him out of because the house was bigger than I expected and I didn't want him hiding somewhere stupid and getting hurt. We compromised by playing a simple card matching game at the coffee table, then a video game on the little console in the family room. It was one of those kids' games where you basically just run around collecting stuff and the character can't really die. Around 7:45, I heated up the food Diana had left. It was mac and cheese and chicken nuggets. Basically babysitter cheat code. Charlie ate in front of the TV, which his parents probably didn't normally let him do, but I wasn't trying to be the strict babysitter on my first paid job. After dinner, we brushed his teeth and went to his room. His room was on the 2nd floor. The house had this wide hallway that ran past a couple bedrooms and a bathroom. Charlie's room was at the end, and it had a small closet with sliding doors. Inside, from what I could tell earlier when he grabbed a toy, it was mostly little kid clothes and some storage bins on the top shelf. His room had a hamper in the corner by his dresser, one of those tall ones with a lid. There was a nightlight on his dresser that glowed soft yellow. I tucked him in and read him a short book. And as I was walking out, he asked if I'd stay in the hallway for a minute. I stood outside his door and listened to him rustle around for maybe 30 seconds. Then his voice went quiet and I figured he was settled. I left his door cracked like they said. Diane had showed me the guest bedroom where I could hang out once Charlie was asleep. It was down the hallway from Charlie's room closer to the stairs. It had a small TV like a spare room TV, and a bed with a comforter that looked like it was never used. I turned the TV on and flipped through the channels until I found some random show. I lay on top of the bed, shoes off, phone in my pocket. Felt like the job was basically done, but that lasted maybe 40 minutes. I was half watching the TV when I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. I looked up and Charlie was standing in the doorway of the guest room. He was rubbing his eyes and holding a stuffed animal. His face didn't look sleepy though. He looked scared. I asked what was wrong. He didn't come in at first. He just whispered, "Chris." I motioned him over and he walked in slowly like he didn't want to turn his back to the hallway. He said he heard something in his closet. I tried to assure him it was likely a house-settling noise that houses creak a lot. He shook his head fast, saying no, it was more like a scratch. I still knew it had to just be typical toddler imagination. I told him there were no monsters in his closet and asked if he wanted me to check. He nodded and I walked him back to his room. I turned his light on fully and looked at the closet. The sliding doors were closed. I slid one open and peeked inside. Admittedly, I took just a quick peek because I knew no one was in there and I just saw a bunch of clothes. I even pushed some clothes aside like I was actually searching. I slid the door closed and saw relief on his face. I tucked him back in and went back to the guest room, but 15 minutes later, I heard footsteps again. This time, Charlie came in quicker, and he was more upset. He said, "Chris, the closet door moved." I sat up and tried not to show annoyance, even though I felt it for a second. I tried to stay patient. I said, "Okay, let's go check." We walked back down the hallway, and when we got to his room, I stopped in the doorway. The closet door was fully open. One of the sliding panels was pushed all the way to the side. I stared at it for a second, and I remember my stomach doing this little drop, not because I thought someone was in there right away, but because it didn't match what I remembered. I knew I closed it. I looked at Charlie and asked why he opened that in a tone that would imply I'm not happy. But the way he swore he didn't, it didn't come across like he was lying. I walked over and slid the closet door shut. But the thing is, the way it closed, it didn't feel like it could have drifted open on its own. I gave Charlie a look meant to imply that I knew he was playing around with the door, maybe trying to scare me. I tucked him back in and told him he was fine and to go to sleep. I left the room, and on the way back to the guest bedroom, I caught myself listening for sounds behind me like someone was walking in the hallway. I told myself to stop being stupid. I was 15 in a family friend's house on a safe street. About 10 minutes later, instead of footsteps, I heard Charlie call out. It wasn't a scream, but rather a shaky raised voice like he was trying not to yell, but needed me. It came from his room. I got up and walked out. As I got closer, I could hear him crying softly. I stepped into his room and saw him sitting in bed with tears on his face. I immediately looked at the closet. The door was closed. That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. I said, "Hey buddy, what happened?" He didn't answer right away. He just lifted his arm and pointed toward the corner of the room. I followed where he was pointing, and for a second my brain didn't process what I was seeing. There was a hamper in that corner, and behind it, pressed into the narrow space between the hamper and the wall, was a person crouched down. They were hiding, trying to make themselves as small as possible. The first thing I saw was a shoulder, then the shoes, then his partially hidden face, but I could see his eyes looking straight at me. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 seconds before my body reacted. I didn't scream. I simply decided it was time to move. So I grabbed Charlie with both arms, yanked him out of bed, and picked him up like he weighed nothing. I backed toward the door, never taking my eyes off that corner. The person surprisingly didn't move at first. They stayed crouched as if they stayed still enough we'd forget he was there. I ran us toward the guest room and locked the door. I did my best to keep Charlie quiet as I called 911. I told the operator there was someone in the house. I gave the address and said I was babysitting and there was a man in the kids' room. The operator asked if the intruder had a weapon. I said I didn't know. She asked if we were safe. I said we were locked in a bedroom upstairs. She told me to stay on the line. I kept expecting the doorknob to start turning or expecting the door to shake. The operator kept talking to me to keep me calm, asking me to describe the person, but I couldn't. All I could say was I saw the person's eyes hidden behind a hamper. The eventual sound of distant sirens getting closer was the first time I was ever relieved to hear police sirens in my life. The operator told me to wait until an officer came to my door and identified themselves. When the police finally came upstairs, one of them knocked and said, "Chris," because I guess dispatch had my name. I unlocked the door and opened it, and 2 officers were there with flashlights. They looked past me into the room, then at Charlie. They had already done a sweep downstairs and didn't see anyone. They didn't have to kick the door down because the front door was wide open. They checked every possible hiding spot in the house. Whoever it was had left. They said based on the timeline, he probably slipped out fast when I went down the stairs and ran out the front door. When Mark and Diane got home, they arrived to the police cars outside and officers in their living room. A lot of emotions filled the room for sure. Mark asked me questions I couldn't really answer, just like the police did. The cop asked about the locks and entry points. Mark immediately went to the back door and checked it. I followed because I felt like I needed to see. The deadbolt at the top was unlocked. Mark looked at me and asked, "Did you lock both locks like I said?" I said, "I locked the bottom one." He said, "The bottom one pops if the knob gets jiggled." That's why he told me both. He wasn't raising his voice, but I knew he was upset. However, he didn't stay upset for long and was grateful I saved Charlie from danger. The worst part is thinking about what would have happened if Charlie hadn't come to get me. If he'd stayed in his room trying to be brave while that person was in there. Or if I'd been downstairs messing around on my phone, not paying attention. Or if I told Charlie to go back to bed without checking. So to parents or babysitters or anyone out there who takes care of kids, don't always dismiss the things they say as just their imagination. The third time I babysat AJ was the only time I was ever asked to stay overnight at someone else's house. And it's also the last time I ever babysat for anyone at all. I was 17, a senior in high school, and I had already watched AJ twice before. He was 8, quiet, and the kind of kid who didn't really look at you when you talked to him. The first time I met his mom, she told me he was a loner and mostly kept to himself, so I shouldn't expect much interaction. She said that like it was a good thing, like it meant the job would be easy. And honestly, the first 2 times kind of were. I barely had to do anything besides heat up food and remind him when it was time to get ready for bed. He'd just sit in his room playing video games like Grand Theft Auto for hours. The third time was different because his mom asked if I could spend the night. She said she had to be out of town for work and wouldn't be back until late the next morning. She sounded stressed on the phone, like she didn't have many options, so I said yes. I figured it would be the same as before, just longer and more money. When I got to the house that afternoon, she rushed through the instructions at the kitchen counter while AJ was already upstairs. She said there was frozen pizza in the freezer and he usually fed himself breakfast cereal and I could sleep in the extra room at the end of the hallway. She thanked me like 3 times before she even left. When she did, I called up the stairs to let AJ know I was there, even though he already knew, and he just yelled back a short, "Yeah," without coming down. For the next few hours, I barely saw him. I could hear the video games through the ceiling, the sounds of gunshots and cars crashing in his game. At one point, I went upstairs to check on him and found him sitting on the floor of his room, controller in hand, eyes locked on the screen. He didn't look away when I asked if he was okay. He just nodded while staring at the TV. I went back downstairs and tried to watch something in the living room, but it felt weird being in someone else's house overnight. Around 7, I made the pizza and called AJ down. When he came down, he didn't say hi or anything. He just grabbed 2 slices, looked at me with this expression I still can't fully describe, like I'd done something to annoy him just by existing, and then went back upstairs without a word. He was acting unfriendlier than usual this time. I stood there in the kitchen holding my own plate, feeling awkward and kind of unwelcome in a house I was supposed to be in charge of for the night. I figured he was just a weird kid and didn't take it personally. After I cleaned up, I went upstairs to get ready for bed. The guest room was basic and small. I left the door half open because I didn't like the idea of being fully closed in. I was sitting on the bed talking to my friend Bree when I got this strange feeling like I was being watched. I looked up and saw AJ's head slowly move back out of view from the crack in the doorway. He had just been standing there looking in. I laughed a little because it startled me more than anything, and I called out to him asking what he was doing. He didn't answer. I heard soft footsteps go down the hallway toward his room. I remember thinking it was kind of funny, like he was just being a nosy kid, and I didn't think much of it after that. Around 11 o'clock, I put my phone down and turned off the lamp. I rolled onto my side and closed my eyes, trying to fall asleep. I don't know how much time passed before I felt like I wasn't alone in the room. I opened my eyes and saw a dark shape at the foot of the bed. Took a few seconds for me to process that it was someone standing there. I let out a scream before I could stop myself and scrambled for the lamp. When I turned it on, I saw AJ standing at the end of the bed, completely still. The look on his face is still hard to describe. He looked annoyed yet also scared or regretful of what he was about to do. Both of his hands were behind his back. I sat up and asked him what he was doing in there. He didn't answer. I told him to show me what he had behind his back. He shook his head no, still not breaking eye contact. That scared me more than if he yelled or cried. I got out of bed and moved toward him, telling him he needed to go back to his room. When I reached him, I grabbed his arm and turned him slightly. And that's when I saw the handle of a large kitchen knife in his hand. That's when I screamed again and covered my mouth with my hand without even meaning to. I yelled at him to get out of the room, to go, to leave. My whole body was shaking. He didn't argue. He just ran out into the hallway, still holding the knife. I rushed to the door, slammed it shut, and locked it. I fumbled with my phone trying to call his mom because my hands were actually shaking. When she answered, I could barely get the words out. I told her AJ came into my room with a knife while I was sleeping. There was a long silence on the other end. Then her voice changed completely. She sounded horrified, like she had been expecting something bad, but not this bad. She kept apologizing over and over, saying she was so sorry and that she believed me. I told her I couldn't stay. I didn't care about the money or anything else. I just needed someone else to come watch him. She didn't argue at all. She said she would call her ex-husband and have him come right away. I stayed locked in that room for almost an hour, scared shitless. Eventually, there was a knock at the front door and a man's voice calling AJ's name. I cracked the guest room door and saw a man I recognized from a photo in the house. He went straight down the hall toward AJ's room without saying much to me. I grabbed my bag, walked past them without looking into AJ's room, and left the house as fast as I could. His mom sent me the money through Venmo later that night along with another long apology, but I never went back there. I never even babysat for another family after that. I feel like I was actually close to becoming a news article online about a babysitter getting murdered by a child. I was 21 when my sister asked me to watch her kids overnight while she and her husband went to a wedding a few hours away. I had babysat my niece Emma and my nephew Lucas plenty of times before, so it wasn't a big deal. Emma was 6, quiet and sensitive, and Luke was 9, more talkative but still easy. They live in a normal suburban house in a quiet neighborhood not far from our childhood home. My sister walked me through the usual routine before they left, since this time I'd be staying overnight. Leftover Chinese food for dinner and no scary shows, and bed by 9 o'clock. She reminded me Emma sometimes got nervous at night and might call for me once or twice. After they left, the kids and I ate in the living room and watched a movie. Felt like a completely normal night. Around 9 o'clock I took them upstairs. Their bedrooms were across the hall from each other with a bathroom in between. I tucked Emma in first. She asked if I'd leave her door open a little and keep the hallway light on. Lucas just rolled over and told me good night like he was already half asleep. I went downstairs and turned on the TV, keeping the volume low so they wouldn't hear. Around like 9:30 to 10 o'clock, I heard footsteps upstairs. I figured Emma needed something. I started up the stairs, but before I got halfway, I saw her walking along the balcony toward the top step. She was standing there in her pajamas, looking down at me. I asked what was wrong. She said I already came in her room and told her to go back to sleep, but she hadn't been able to. I stopped on the stairs and told her I hadn't been upstairs since I put them to bed. She thought I was joking at first. She said I stood in her doorway a few minutes ago and told her everything was fine in a whisper. I told her maybe she was dreaming it and walked her back to her room. I checked her closet and under the bed even though I knew nothing would be there. She finally settled back in, but she kept watching me as I left like she wasn't convinced. I went back downstairs feeling slightly uneasy but still telling myself kids mix dreams with reality all the time. About 20 minutes later, Lucas came down rubbing his eyes. He asked why I came into his room. I felt a chill go through me. I told him I didn't. He said I stood by his dresser and looked at him, then walked out without saying anything. I tried to keep my voice calm and told him he must have been half asleep. But now this was weird because both of them said pretty similar things. Instead of going back to bed, he stayed next to me on the couch. Now that was when I started to really listen to the house. Every small sound felt louder. I turned the TV off and the silence literally made my ears ring. Lucas noticed me doing this and I think it started to scare him when I told him to shush for a second. I heard something upstairs. It was light footsteps running, and then I saw her running across the balcony upstairs and then racing down the stairs, screaming Uncle Dan a bunch of times. When she got to the living room, I asked her what's wrong and she started crying, saying there's someone upstairs. I think this was around the time my heart really started racing. They weren't playing a little kid prank on me. She was crying genuine tears. I asked her why she thought there's someone upstairs, and she responded saying someone came in her room again and said goodnight, but it didn't sound like me. I think by now I was internally freaking the out, but I told them to keep calm. I didn't want Emma to cause Lucas to start crying now too. I told them to wait down here. I'll go check upstairs and be right back. And that's exactly what I planned to do. But I wasn't going up there without a weapon at this point. I went to the kitchen, secretly grabbed a knife, and placed it in front of me as I walked back into the living room and then up the stairs. The kids were still on the couch. I made it to the upstairs balcony that overlooks the living room. I did a little march as I walked across it to try to make them laugh, but it didn't work. As I passed the balcony and into the upstairs foyer that led to the kids' bedrooms, I can't iterate enough just how much I wasn't expecting what happened next. I heard something in Emma's room. I peered inside and thought I saw something or someone. I quietly said hello so the kids wouldn't hear, but I wasn't expecting someone to respond. In a very weird, high-pitched voice, yet still sounding like a grown man, someone said, "Aren't they just so special?" The voice sounded like it belonged to someone with mental issues. Maybe not fully there. I then realized what I was seeing in the bedroom was a really tall person standing next to Emma's bed now. Guess like 6 feet 4 inches. They looked to be like 6 and taller than me. My heart was in my throat. I turned and ran down the stairs and grabbed the kids. I told them, "Put your shoes on now. We're leaving." And Emma started to cry even more. Quickly saw why. Peering around the wall up the balcony upstairs was this grotesque-looking man doing peekaboo with his hands toward the kids. I said, "Forget the shoes," and ran the kids outside with me in their socks. We ran to a house a couple doors down where I saw lights on inside and I rang the bell 5 times. The lady who answered knew Lucas and Emma. I introduced myself and quickly explained the situation. She let us in immediately into safety. I got on the phone with 911 and stood on the front porch of this couple's house watching my sister's house. And as I saw that man casually strolling out of her house, walking down the walkway into the darkness of the street in the opposite way, the 911 operator told me not to engage him in any way and that officers would be there soon. But boy, do I regret listening to that operator. I should have followed that creep down the street. I should have been a man and beaten him to a pulp. But realistically, I didn't know if he was armed or not. And based on his voice, I choose to believe it was some mentally handicapped person who simply walked right into the house. I stayed on the stoop watching the man until he disappeared down an intersecting street. And I told the operator which street it was. She kept making it seem like the cops would be heading down that direction, but it took so long for them to arrive that by then that man was gone, possibly into one of the houses in the vicinity for all anyone would know. I wasn't happy with the response time and I let the police know that. I went into my sister's house with them to investigate and nothing seemed out of the sorts, nor was anyone else inside. Of course, given the circumstances, I drove the kids home to my parents' house with me that night to sleep there. We weren't going to sleep in that house that night regardless. And of course there was somehow blame put on me that the one night I was watching them, someone breaks into the house. However, I firmly believe that man was in there before I even got there. I did not go needlessly unlocking doors or anything like that. Ever since then, my sister and my brother-in-law have been nuts with the security cameras. They have at least 6 all over the house inside and out. But honestly, who can blame them after this?